If you ever thought about trying retro gaming, you had definitely heard about playing on a CRT TV. While not necessary, the idea is that all TVs give games their original and intended look. Some say that the original picture is the best looking picture, and some say that CRT is the only way to play to get full experience. And while I wouldn't be so radical about the only way, I can't pass the opportunity to have the best picture. And so I bought this 14-inch professional video monitor, Sony PVM-14L5. You can't really be picky today, the one I got has broken back cover. I think it might have been hit with something heavy. But the tube doesn't have any burn-ins and the brightness is nice, there is color bleed in couple places and convergence issues in corners. With overall dirty appearance, I can say that this monitor has seen some heavy use for sure. I'll try to give every part of it some attention. That includes basic operations, like cleaning, recapping, and adjusting the picture. But also crafts that you won't find in a regular restoration video. Before we start, I have to note that I bought another similar monitor 2 years ago, 14L4, but I got into a moving situation and had to leave it behind. I will use some old footage of me tinkering with it. First of all, monitor doesn't have legs. When put in a rack, not having legs may save space, but I don't want to scratch my table. I don't have any sort of workshop, so yeah, IKEA tables for life. I bought the first rubber legs I found on Amazon. The only thing, I wish they could have been slightly higher. Monitor top cover is held by 3 screws on each side and 2 screws at the back. Apart from ample amount of dust inside, you can see another broken plastic part, the board frame. I collect all plastic pieces and save them for later. I was thinking about gluing them together with plastic glue, but spoiler, it didn't go well. For this grade of monitors, I've heard that you don't have to discharge the tube if it stayed without power for some time, and it isn't mentioned in the manual to do any discharging. I push anode cap to the right, this will release one side of the hook contact, then the cap can be pulled out. Old grease under the cap makes it slippery, so I'm struggling a lot here. Next, I remove all boards one by one. First goes off D board, also known as the deflection board. I don't mark any cables, because I've memorized their connection points after doing my first monitor. Besides, almost all of them have very specific length and number of pins, making it impossible to mix things up. And in the worst case scenario, I can always refer to the manual. In a very natural order, next goes C board, usually called the neck board. I've read that it's supposed to have some sort of clamp to hold it on the tube, but I've never seen any pictures of it. Instead, it's this grey silicone. I cut it with the knife and wiggle the board off. Fancy tube connector I remove with a screwdriver. As for the ground wires, I have to say that I hate their connectors with passion. You need to press down little tab, otherwise they can't be pulled. And the tab is only accessible with something thin, they will be replaced. Set of processor boards, mainly B board, is located on another side of the monitor. You may see blobs of flux residue on the back side of the board, I will comment on them later. Q board with all inputs is held in place only by connecting to other boards and to the plastic of the cover. I wonder why it wasn't designed to be screwed to the bottom of the case. Lastly, G board with power supply and flyback transformer is held by plastic clips and 2 screws of a different length. You may already guess that this board will be the hardest to work with, because of all the heat sinks and enclosures. Before removing the tube, I am undoing 4 screws for the bezel and pulling it off. These patches of electrical tape looks like something straight from the factory, so I don't think anyone ever removed the bezel before. The tube I will be placing on a regular mousepad, rubber side up. This way I can easily rotate it on the table. Tube enclosure with the degauss wire is bolted to the tube, with only top nuts having a washer. The yoke assembly has a fastening band on top. The plastic under the band is very thin and very brittle, and what's worse, it's stuck to the tape. Also check how strangely rubber wedges are placed. On my first monitor they were symmetrical. Anyhow, I cut silicone from them and wiggled the yoke out. I only broke one of the leaves, and considering how shattered back cover and D-board frame were, I should consider myself lucky. Now let me show the initial state of all boards and other components. Yoke has one wire sticking out, and I swear it wasn't me. These patches of tape have some sort of magnetic compound under them. I've read that this was a part of the production, to make yoke closer to the reference model. And this white fixture that's supposed to hold convergence and purity rings in place is broken. Someone has made adjustments to the monitor, that's for sure. G-board has more interesting stuff. Wires on the back I figured come from the factory, as there were same wires on my first monitor. But then there is a flux on some capacitors, meaning they were changed. And one small SMD capacitor that looks like a modification. Later I will find out that this small cap comes from a service bulletin, meaning this monitor had a maintenance performed, supposedly by a Sony tech. The input board is one that I am dreading to work with. 0 capacitors are changed on it. I have to think that's because it is fixed to the covering plate with 5 big solder points, plus all input sockets are bolted to the cover and soldered to the board. B-board, on the other hand, has lots if not most of the capacitors changed. I watched many restoration videos, but I've never seen anyone touching B-board, so that's another point to the Sony tech who work on this monitor. If we assume that there are no deflection circuits on the processor board, then it must mean that changing capacitors was a preventative measure, or the monitor was used in such bad conditions that capacitors all have gone bad. Crumbling plastic may imply that it might be later, but who knows, right? The neck board has another modification and flux on the main connector. I've read that it is considered a good practice to reflow solder on big or heavy components, like transformers, because solder joints are only that strong. With vibration or heavy hits, solder joints may break, resulting in an unstable work or worse. And finally, D-board has all things combined. First, there is a trio of capacitors glued together with silicon, then a mystery component wrapped in a rubbery sleeve and grey substance. One film capacitor that is touching a transistor and seems to be out of place. 2 modifications on the smaller board, broken frame as I've already said, and one big capacitor sticking out on the underside of the main board. Right, that's it for an overview. With the current state in mind, changed capacitors, all technical bulletins applied and yoke position, this monitor either was in possession of another person who likes to tinker with old stuff, or what I prefer to think, was looked after by a Sony tech. In any scenario, while I won't be able to make it look like new, I have to keep the level of maintenance. Starting from the yoke, I first removed 2 black plastic covers and one of the boards under revealed to be loose. There was a plastic clip that is now broken, so the board is basically only held by coil wires. I want to remove and clean magnetic convergence and purity rings too. This white residue doesn't look good and makes the rotation of rings hard. It hit me later that I may want to fix the dangling board with hot glue, at least temporarily, before washing, because every part will be washed thoroughly. Just look at the tube. I cut silicon with a knife and tear rubber wedges off. This one convergence strip looks suspicious. The tube must be of good quality if it only needs one strip. I remove all plastic holders from the tube shield, remove this braided wire that connects the tube to the ground. Cut tape and remove the Gauss coil. It had additional fastening rubber pieces that have now fully disintegrated from heat and age. Anyway, after some soapy treatment, metallic parts need one round of IPA to clean off glue remnants. I couldn't remove yellow stains though, this dirt is too deep in the paint, but I can live with that. Negative wire has one of these connectors that I hate. I will replace it with a new single wire and a regular spade connector. I tore off old wire, then cut a part of bigger ring connector to make a clamp. Some may say that this is too much work for something so minuscule, but I know that I will assemble and disassemble this monitor enough times that it will make it worth the effort. I then washed all plastic parts and aluminum shield, removed all old silicone, cleaned magnetic rings, and washed the yoke. Moved hot glue to be on the inside part of the board, and added glue to the second board, just in case. You can see one of the tape patches holding magnetic material inside the yoke is black now. It's nothing, I accidentally ripped old tape off and replaced with a new patch. I put all yoke parts back and it looks so much nicer already. For the degauss coil, in place of old rubbery tube, I wrap coil with a type of automotive tape, don't know how it's called. I can't even guess what additional material was here for, but with tape, coil now very accurately and without play fits into clamps. The tube I washed with water. This black carbon coating on sides is commonly called the aqueduct. It isn't soluble by water here, but be careful with alcohol. Old fabric tape I replaced with same automotive tape I used for the degauss coil. Assembly is trivial. First I attach screen shield. Yoke are slide and secure in place, but do not put rubber wedges under. They will be installed when monitor maintenance is finished, after I do all picture adjustments. Next, the boards. The main operation on monitors or TVs that everyone is talking about is changing capacitors. Most people go for replacing only a few caps in the deflection circuit, ones that directly affect the picture. Replacing all capacitors is what I am going to do. I don't want any surprises later, capacitors are inexpensive, plus it's fun, so why not? I wrote down all capacitor values from all boards, only 2 of them from G board I first had to desolder as they are located in very tight places. I compiled all my notes in a spreadsheet, let me explain what's in it. Capacitance is a base parameter, it has to be met. Voltage can be higher, although I've heard recommendations that it shouldn't be many times over the initial value. In various places, capacitors are wider than they are printed on the PCB. Sometimes they are touching other components and I don't like that. I've tried to order caps with the proper diameter. For the height, some of the big caps are located under heatsinks, so they can be very tall. Also, all capacitors on B board and Q board have height restrictions. Lead spacing matters for the big capacitors. They need their legs to have specific spread to sit properly on the PCB. In notes column, I marked everything that is not basic, like low impedance or custom series, bipolar capacitors. I also left notes comparing with the Save Pad cap kit. I got the impression that people who do deflection circuit recap only are usually using this kit. Compared to what I have installed on the board, this kit sounds like it was compiled from an old service manual. And about the manual. Yes, it does have a list of all components, but there is a catch. First, remember that small board attached to the deflection board, with a purple cap. Well, this board has different structure in the manual. Based on all technical bulletins, let's assume that there were many internal revisions of monitors, but the manual is one, so it must cover the latest revision only. And second, I wrote a sample script to parse the manual. When there is an upgrade in voltage, that's one question, but there are also downgrades and change in capacitance. I can use the manual for reference, but I can't be certain that my unit will work with listed components, so I want to stick with what's on the boards. The second sheet has all caps grouped by their main stats. I want to buy good parts and have made a little investigation on what capacitor series means what. I will be using two manufacturers, Chemicon and Rubicon, same that's already on the boards. I also aimed for capacitors rated for 105 degrees Celsius. Don't know if anyone will find this information useful, but here are all links on the last sheet. In any case, while I was waiting for the capacitors to arrive, I decided to treat myself and bought a desoldering gun. And as soon as caps arrived, I got to work. The process of removing components with the gun is the most boring one. Capacitors pop right off. I also removed all transistors with heatsinks. I want to clean them and replace thermal compound. Don't look at the ground wire that I also removed. For a moment I thought that it was old and ugly and should be replaced. Now I think that it's green and cool and I will put it back later. The board is now much lighter and ready to be washed. I have flux remover this time. I am using it first, then wash with APA, then with distilled water, then with dish soap, then remove water with compressed air and finally dry the board with a hair dryer. Yellow stains can be fully removed, but at least the board isn't sticky anymore. I cleaned all thermal paste with alcohol and will put transistors back first. New paste is a regular PC thermal paste, non-conductive. You may have noticed blue sheets under some chips. It's a silicon insulation sheet. I will replace them with aluminum oxide sheets. They have much higher thermal conductivity. They come in different sizes, but I have only one and for bigger transistors I will use a thermal pad. I wrote down all component names and places where they must be installed. Applying a thin layer of thermal paste or a patch of thermal pad, I place each transistor in its place and solder them all in bulk in the end. I can say that the board looked much better without all the white gunk around. After transistors, it is time for capacitors. There is little to mention. I do not bend capacitor legs to hold them, but rather tuck one leg right away. It must be easier this way if I, or anyone else, need to replace any of them in the future. The big cap has a special terminal. I have soldered 2 wires to the legs and will glue the capacitor to the board with silicone. It is a sloppy job, I know, but that's all my options. After hardening for a day, silicone is holding tight. After all capacitors are inserted, I solder them for good, then cut legs. But that's not all for the board. The wires on the underside are bothering me. I will replace them with shorter ones. Here is one last view before second round of washing. And after final washing. No dirt, no dust, no old flux, no old thermal paste. I think the board has turned out alright. Monitor base is dusty and needs cleaning too. This black tape on one side seems to be covering sharp edge. All edges of this case are sharp, but only this one sticks out when the case has removed top cover. I've planned to file and sand all edges after washing the base, and cut myself twice in the process. Speaker and all plastic holders I removed to clean separately. Here is the result. The base is clean, the edges are smooth. Speaker I wiped with alcohol, it has a paper membrane, so I don't think it can survive a water bath. I install holders back, put the board in place and secure it with 2 screws. I assembled the monitor back to check if it still works, and everything seems to be alright. Because I have a desoldering gun now, I want to try it on the input board. I stripped it from all removable pieces, power socket, faceplate and backplate. On my first monitor, I concluded that it was impossible to remove this metal frame, and I can confirm that now. I don't see how I could have made it without the desoldering gun. What I'm doing here is I remove most of the flux, then bend middle tabs with pliers. They will stop the board from being separated from the frame. Then I desolder all input sockets. They can't be removed yet, but in this free state they will come off together with the frame. Lastly, I add a batch of fresh solder and flux to the frame solder points, and by heating them one by one I remove the board. I tore off traces on one of the solder points, but while ugly, it doesn't affect anything. This is all ground and it's all connected in multiple other places. With the board now free, I can remove all the capacitors. No one touched them ever, they all have bent legs right from the factory and a pain to work with. Then again, nothing little patience can solve. I didn't wash the board after removing all caps. It isn't that abstracted with components as the G board. I can clean it after all new capacitors are put in. All the capacitors here are miniature ones. Because I've tried to order 105 degrees rated caps, they all have bigger size than the old ones. But it's okay, they will not be touching each other or any other components. As I've said, I don't bend capacitor legs to hold them in place, but I do form the legs to have a nicer fit. I would feel bad if I have to force caps through wider holes. The idea is simple, legs will have sort of a step. I do the forming with thin pliers, bend legs outwards, then inwards. And I keep saying legs, I know they are called terminal leads, sorry if that bothers anyone. I wish I could add anything about soldering, but the process is straightforward. Nomenclature is in the notebook, polarity is on the board. There was one funny thing though, I missed one capacitors when I was writing them down in the notebook. I skipped it, but when I soldered all other caps, I was left with 2 spares. I have counted removed ones and figured that I need the last one to be 25 volts 47 microfarad. It took me a while to find out why I had one spare cap. It was because when ordering from both DigiKey and Mouser, 10 elements usually cost less than 9. The price drops right after you order 10 items or more. Quick note on the power socket. When I was washing the board, I mistakenly decided to wash it too. Water got inside somehow and I had to disassemble it. The soldering was tricky, but this socket will be clean inside too now, so that's something. Here are all cleaned parts. It's nothing special, just no dust or old flux. When I put together board and frame, I decided to not solder them. I only bent tabs in the middle, and even this is not strictly necessary as I see it. The board has no structural load, input sockets are all bolted to the frame. I solder sockets to the board, give it another light wash with flux remover, then put on its place the power socket. I won't install a power cord holder, it has no use with the cord I have, which is a regular PC power cord. Also front plate and back plate. And assembled board, nice and clean. I test every board after I'm done working with it, input board is no exception. The third board, or rather set of boards, is the processor boards. There are 5 of them, but only 3 have capacitors for replacement. I wrote down all values and places, except I was hesitant at first about changing capacitors in silver casings. They looked for me like a solid polymer capacitors, which aren't known to degrade as fast as electrolytic ones, and should basically last forever. So I didn't order a replacement for them, which now I think I should have. But well, delivery cost $20, I can't simply order something that I've missed. These caps have to wait for my next order. Here is good example where capacitors with bigger footprint touch each other and another component. I have found Rubicon capacitors with proper width but with low life expectancy spec. And Chemicon capacitors with proper width, high hours, but with the height around the limit of this place. The expansion card is located on top of this board. I've ordered both types of caps, and the height of Chemicon capacitors was just right. After removing all old caps, I need to form all new ones and start putting them in. Nothing new here at all, these boards were interesting for me for something else. This old ground wire is too long, I can route it in a way that it will be fully hidden under the top B1 board. I made a new wire and it should be aligned like that. The original wire was connected to the top of the expansion board metal frame, and it will be connected to the same frame, but to the bottom. Time to clean the boards now. I've read that boards may be covered in flux from the factory, that's the process of automatic soldering. This flux can be washed, but Sony apparently didn't do that. Can say if absence of the flux will harm boards in the long run, we'll make an update after 10 years maybe. Speaking about fragile plastic, the back cover and the deflection board frame were always broken, and now I broke the processor board frame. I tried to glue pieces together with plastic cement, but it didn't work. Plastic has deteriorated so much, it can't be melted by the glue anymore. This leaves me with the only option. I glued the frame with hot glue and measured it to make a 3D print, of course. I am using Autodeck Fusion, it's free and relatively easy to use. Here is an updated version, initially I miscalculated a couple of things. I will upload an STL file somewhere. I didn't immediately come to the idea of printing the part. It hadn't crossed my mind that technology is ready, because every time I see something 3D printed, it is low quality anime models or phone charger holders. For testing how it goes, I opted for using one of the cheapest resins, Somos Imagine Black, and you don't have to own a printer too. These PCB manufacturers everyone is advertising on YouTube seems to be having 3D printing capabilities. Delivery will cost you big money though. My point here is that if life gives you a broken D-board frame, you learn a new skill. I have to trim this row of gussets, and the total height is 2 mm higher than the original frame. It doesn't stop boards to be attached to the frame, but will cause one major problem later. I screw B board to the new frame, attach ground wire to the metal shield of the expansion port. Then put back second processor board. Check out this bigger crystal. I couldn't stand how crooked it was, so I removed silicone that held it and put it straight. Attaching the audio board and done. I hope you got tired of me showing how I replace capacitors, because I've lost footage of me replacing capacitors on the neckboard and on the deflection board. I'll show how they look now. The neckboard has a nice green matte finish when it's clean. I have changed 7 caps on the board, didn't touch ones with silver casings. The board under these three ICs is burned. When the monitor is working they got very hot. Can't say if it's natural for them to be that hot, but I desoldered and changed thermal paste just in case. Now remember I talked about technical bulletins. They are operations that can be performed to fix various issues. Here on the neckboard I have a discharge gap from 2004 bulletin. However, monitor serial number is not on the list of units that require the modification. And there is another modification from the previous year about adding 3 diodes to the neckboard, but it wasn't done. I can't possibly know what may be the situation with bulletins or this particular monitor, so I will leave whatever is on the boards now. Later, if I manage to find more information, I may return to the neckboard, because one of the latest bulletins from 2009 says that both discharge gap and diodes should be installed on all units. That's for the neckboard. I have one random clip of the deflection board after the first wash. I removed 3 big film capacitors that had silicone holding them together. Changed tape on one of the coils, old one was damaged by the nearby connector. And cleaned one secret part that was wrapped in the tube. It is revealed to be a 22 ohm resistor. Here are all boards fully cleaned. On the board with 2 coils, I removed all silicone. I have found both film and big underside capacitors in a 2008 technical bulletin. Both described issues seems to be irrelevant for my use case. Film capacitor I will order and replace later, but since I already got the replacement for the big cap, I swapped it. I managed to fit 2 diodes from another bulletin right between capacitor legs. I just don't like silicone, I guess. On the main board, I cleaned all transistors and replaced thermal paste. I like how clean board looks when everything is in place, without silicone and capacitors on the underside. Broken frame of the deflection board is more common issue than broken processor board frame. You can find a 3D model of it and print yourself, or get already printed one. There is one issue though, screws can hold in their holes. It looks like holes were measured from the board holes, not from the old frame. I have some ugly bigger wall screws, will use them temporarily here. Not sure if the schematics were wrong or if there was an issue in the printing process. But anyhow, here are all boards assembled. This was the last set of boards where I changed capacitors. There are caps on the extension board, they even have been changed by Sony Tech. But I completely forgot about them when I ordered all capacitors, and now the board has to wait for the next order. I washed it, but that's all I can do for now. Monitor bezel doesn't have anything interesting inside, but I want to clean it, and to clean I first had to disassemble. Buttons, if you can call them that, are held by a couple of screws on each side, not much to describe here. PCB with actual buttons is held by a series of plastic clips, and I kid you not, I broke them all, on both sides. You may say that I did something wrong, but I would blame brittle plastic. On my first monitor, boards would come off no problem, so I didn't expect any issues here. But well, the damage is done. On the bright side, construction of the bezel allows these boards to lie free, they don't have to be fixed to any plastic parts to function. There is another thing. You see this turn-off component? It wasn't me. In fact, I think it is a factory defect. I had the exact same component turn off on my first monitor. Anyway, I washed plastic parts, removed all flux stains from boards as usual, and put everything where it was. Technically, I could have just wiped bezel on the outside, but my idea of clean is when I know that every part that can be disassembled and cleaned is disassembled and cleaned. One very last board in the monitor is the power switch board. It has only one purpose, to hold the power switch. And you might think that it deserves nothing more than a regular cleaning, but you see, the board has this plastic cover. The connector has exposed contacts at the bottom, and I think it might be connected right to the main power input. Sounds dangerous, right? The cover is old and crumbly and already missing a couple pieces. And I thought, after all the manipulations I've done so far, shouldn't I try to craft a new one? So I got the pack of Ritz crackers to make a template from the packaging box, taped the template to the PVC sheet I found on Amazon, 0.5 mm thickness, cut the shape with regular scissors and a hobby knife, then sanded all sharp edges and the surface, because of the glossy finish. This is the result. Plastic bends easily and stays formed forever. It is substantially stiffer than the old plastic cover, but it will fit in its place just right. And I have to say I am very satisfied with the result. To be done with all plastic parts, I need to do something with the monitor top cover. Broken back part originally held by 6 plastic clips. Thankfully, cover is still held together by this middle beam. If it had a crack, I for sure would end up with a wide open area at the back of the monitor. I also remove handles and give all parts a good clean. Edges of the case I sanded, but only after I cut myself, 3rd time so far. Clean handles go right in. As for the back part, it is hot glue, this time for real. I managed to find most of the pieces inside the monitor. With enough glue, the cover is quite sturdy once again. I'll try to not put anything heavy on top of the monitor though. Monitor is almost done, but all these cables. It's not that they have a major problem by themselves, but they cling to all other parts, making disassembly so much harder than it should be. From the experience with my first monitor, I know that I may put boards and tube in and out multiple times when I will be doing picture adjustment. On the first monitor, I made an exercise with cable management. I put every cable into a braided sleeve, and while the idea was sound, I can't say that the result was good enough. Sleeves add too much thickness to my liking. Let's assess the current situation first. Cables are somewhat organized, but their length makes me think that most of them were made for a 20-inch models and reused here. I have found service position in the manual, but I don't know if this position could be achieved without disconnecting everything, so what's the point then? And with me likely being the last person who will own this monitor, I am ready to do the irreversible and trim some wires. Current cable organization includes electrical tape and zip ties. I strip everything, wash all cables with dish soap and clean with alcohol tape residue. Ferrite filters I also disassemble and clean. I have started routing with this long cable that runs from the opposite side of the processor board to the deflection board. Initially it just hangs in the air, but it has enough length to be bundled with all other cables. The input board has the most convenient location and connected exclusively to the processor board assembly. Cables in the bottom right corner I am forming into an S shape. This is the only section that will be extendable. I need to have processor board's block to be able to move. It will be clear what for later. Right near the flyback transformer, 2 bundles of cables meet, from the processor board and from the deflection board. They weren't connected originally, but I will make them run together. Here is what I will be working with. Some cables are looped and need to be shortened. Deflection board wires will be running at the bottom of the board. And check how long are bezel cables, I have to cut them in half. Then I cut wires to their target length, strip them. The connector type used here is called GST-EH. I have ordered new contacts from DigiKey and crimping dies from Amazon. The crimping process is a little finicky. I first press in a contact, then put wire inside. While this crimping dice is not the exact tool that should be used, it works alright. You can also find GST connectors on Amazon, but I tried them and they were bad. When I was done cutting and connecting, I have gone over all connectors and checked the connectivity. I have found one wire that was snapped and was hanging just by the isolation material. The breaking point was located right where a zip tie was. I've read that zip ties shouldn't be used for cable binding anyway. The wire I replaced, but I need to think what I will use for the cable organization. There are plenty of techniques. Zip ties, hook and loop tapes, electrical tape. I can't say I was especially excited to use any of those. And then I have dug out the cable lacing from internet archives. Supposedly being used even by NASA, it gives me a vintage tech vibe with all these old telephone systems. Nevertheless, I decided to give it a try and you judge how it looks. Lacing process is not hard at all. I bought a roll of shoes crafting thread. The thread is made of plastic and boxed, exactly what needed for lacing. I begin by winding a starting knot, then proceed with running knots, and finish by winding the same knot as at the start, only using small separate loop to pull the thread in the opposite direction in the end. The cable bends easily and doesn't have any space for individual wires to cling to anything, and the resulting width is minimal along the whole length of the cable. I didn't film the lacing process for other cables because of how fiddly the process is. Here is what I ended up with. Even iPhone decided he wants to be a vintage tech and said that 30 FPS is enough. 2 vertical bundles of cables may look like they will be standing in the way of something, but they won't. An S-shaped section bends and extends just to the right length for the processor board to move away when needed. Cut to the length, cables look very accurate now, at least for me. There are more wires that need attention. First is the degauss coil wire. I cut out the connector and fixed to the frame ferrite filter with double-sided tape, just so it won't rattle inside. Then the yoke wire. I've shortened it and laced. And lastly, I made new ground wires with a simpler connector. Alright, I've assembled the monitor to finally do picture adjustments. I had color bleed originally, here is an extreme version. It is caused by the yoke sitting in a random position. And the convergence, it isn't here at all. Don't know what I want to say by showing you this, maybe that all picture issues could be fixed? I will be doing operations according to the monitor's service manual. It is said in the manual that we need to make initial adjustments, then do them again for real, and then, if anything isn't perfect, do it again, and again. I'll save you time and jump right into the middle of the cycle. I didn't do a factory reset, I don't have all the tools to calibrate color and signal levels, so I have to leave this for another time. I don't have a second camera to show insides of the monitor, but I will be showing pictures. The first step is purity adjustment, also called landing adjustment in the manual. The goal here is to make color uniform at every part of the display. We need to first display green color only, unscrew and move yoke back as far as possible. Colors will separate, and we need to make them take equal space on the display by spreading purity rings. While I do this, let me note that most controls in the manual have internal Sony names. I will be calling purity rings such, because this seems to be most commonly used name in the community. Now, when color fields are equal, I move yoke back to the point where color will fill the display, but not too far or too close for other colors to bleed. Confirming uniformity on red, green, blue and white screens. Geometry next. By rotating the yoke, image needs to be aligned horizontally. After, there is a set of controls for vertical and horizontal picture size. Plus, lots of geometry tweaking controls. Image from the manual perfectly describes what each of them does. Picture size doesn't have to be set and forgotten. I've heard that different consoles work differently with the overscan area, the red one, where ones will fill it with black color, others might display digital garbage. I will leave borders visible for now, but I can return and readjust at any time. With the picture roughly aligned, we may switch to everyone's favorite, convergence. On my first monitor, I spent quite some time to have it set to a good level. I based my adjustments on YouTube videos, but now I decided to strictly follow the manual, and I was impressed how smooth the process went. Here I grouped convergence rings to have something to work with. I first aligned horizontal convergence with the pot on the neckboard. Then by spreading, but not rotating, set of the rings in the middle, I aligned green to be in the middle between red and blue. And lastly, by spreading set of the rings on the edge, I merged blue and red, making dots in the middle all white. That's for the static convergence, or convergence in the center of the screen. Sides of the picture, or dynamic convergence, may be controlled by multiple coils and pots around the yoke. There are supposed to be 5 controls, and I, somehow, can't find 2 of them. But what affects dynamic convergence the most is the yoke position. I couldn't catch on camera how I set the yoke, but picture from the manual summarizes it well. I repeat all convergence adjustments one more time after setting the yoke. Then all wedges need to be glued to the tube. I first glue top 2 wedges with silicone, wait for it to harden overnight, then glue the bottom wedge. And the result. There will be some light misconvergence in corners, but overall I can call the picture quality good. One last adjustment that I made is focus. I don't have any complaints here, but how can I know if I have focus without touching it? There is 2 controls on the flyback transformer, vertical and horizontal focus. I didn't make image worse, but also I don't think I made it any better. That's it for the picture, I'm putting everything together. Most of the boards are already at their places from previous steps. The build had lasted for so long, there is fresh dust everywhere, I removed it with scant air. You can see how processor boards are moved away to free space, and the deflection board cables are long enough so the board can be put on the table. I have changed wires for the power switch connection because I cut them too short. Now when the tube doesn't need to go anywhere anymore, I screw it in place with 4 bolts and put in place B board assembly. Bezel goes right after. I slide cables under the structural frame, there is plenty of space, no need for plastic holders or tape. I like it how this area is so much less busy now. I then bolt bezel with 4 respective screws, wiping the screen one last time. Anode cap needs a layer of dielectric grease to prevent arcing. I've struggled when I removed the cap because of the old grease, and now the struggle continues. I wipe the cap with alcohol in the end, to stop air dust from sticking to it. The deflection board comes last. I was thinking initially about putting board with 2 coils upside down, to have cable routed under the board, but realized that coils have permanent magnets in their construction, so I would rather put the board as it was. I also missed lacing on the cable, it's just a 15mm thick though. There was a ground wire on this side of the monitor, connected to the tube frame. The bolt was kind of in the way of the top cover, together with bezel cables. Now I want to put this wire under the bolt that holds the deflection board frame. And the hole here is also too big for the old screw. I was about to attach the top cover, and this is when my 2mm misfortune got to me. Because the processor board frame is higher than needed, it bends a little when screwed to the input board. All this construction doesn't allow top cover to be fully closed. Here goes another 2 weeks of waiting for the updated frame. I put it back, make one look at all the work that has been done, and close the monitor. I think I got the best picture I was sold. It took me a couple months to finish everything I wanted, but it was worth it. I'm really excited to play something already, but I need a console to match. This Sega I have, I bought it for testing, I have only 2 games for it. As my first console I always wanted an NES. It doesn't have an RGB output by default, and that's for the next video. Thanks for watching!